It was March 2nd, 1994. A new Aeroflot plane was departing from Moscow to Hong Kong. Everything seemed normal.
Знак «Пристегните ремни безопасности» выключен. Вы можете снять ремни безопасности.
Suddenly, the plane began to bank to the right. The turn grew steeper with every passing second, from 45 to nearly 90 degrees. Then, the plane dropped into a vertical dive, spinning violently at 14,000 feet per minute, making the G-force shoot up to 5 times normal gravity, pushing the co-pilot back into his seat so he couldn't reach the yoke. And much worse than that, a 15-year-old boy was at the control. How could a child pilot the plane? Was this terrorism or something even more unthinkable? His name was Elder Kurdinsky, the son of Aeroflot's captain, Yaroslav Kurdinsky, who was serving as the relief captain for Aeroflot Flight 593 from Moscow to Hong Kong. Aeroflot was Russia's flagship airline, recognized for its rigorous safety standards and highly trained pilots with extensive experience on international routes. Like many airlines, Aeroflot allowed pilots' families to travel with them once a year at a discounted rate, and Captain Kurdinsky took the opportunity to bring his 2 children, Elder and his younger sister, Yana, hoping to give them a first experience of international flight. On the day of the flight, Captain Danilov will be the main captain, who will later take turns with Captain Kurdinsky. Beside him is Piskarev, who serves as the co-pilot. They prepared the aircraft as usual for Aeroflot Flight 593, an Airbus A310-308, which was relatively new and equipped with sophisticated avionics and flight systems. They took off at 13:39 UTC from Moscow, carrying a total of 75 people on board, including 63 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 3 cockpit crew members. Everything went normally during the first 4 hours until it was time for Captain Kurdinsky to take turns with Captain Danilov. At that time, the aircraft was cruising at an altitude of 33,000 feet. With the autopilot engaged, Captain Kurdinsky allowed his children, Eldar and Yana, to visit the cockpit.
Эй, Яна, будешь летать? Давай, бери штурвал.
Yana sat in the captain's seat and held the yoke.
Попробуйте повернуть шток влево.
She turned it to the left, causing the aircraft to bank in that direction. However, this had been intentionally set up by Captain Kurdinsky using the heading select knob, which made the plane turn left by itself and giving Yana the impression that she was actually flying the aircraft. He then turned the knob back to its original position, returning the plane to its proper course. Now it's turn for Elder. He climbed into the captain's seat and grabbed the yoke.
Могу я повернуть это? Управление?
Да, можно.
Then Elder turned the yoke to the left, but it felt very stiff, not as smooth as when his sister had moved it. So he tried turning it harder. Still, the plane didn't respond because the autopilot remained engaged. Then Kurdinsky adjusted the heading select knob, making the yoke respond smoothly. So it seemed that Elder was actually turning the aircraft to the left. Once again, his father returned the heading select knob to its original setting. Then Yana started fussing, wanting to return to her seat.
Зачем? Ты все равно уснешь в салоне первого класса. И не убегай, иначе нас уволят.
At that moment, no one was paying attention to what Elder was doing.
Почему он вращается?
Against the odds, he was the first to notice that the plane was going off course.
Он вращается сам по себе?
Да.
The pilots who were in the cockpit at that moment began to search for an explanation of why the airplane was turning. As the pilots debated the reason for the turn, the plane's bank angle increased to 90 degrees, causing the G-forces to shoot up 5 times normal gravity, pressing Piskarev back into his seat and making him struggle to reach the controls. In the end, Elder was the only one fully in control of the plane, and much worse than that, Kurdinsky couldn't move back into the captain's seat because the G-force had pinned Elder there.
Держи! Держи колонну! Держи!
In response, Elder held his control column in the neutral position.
Повернись в другую сторону! В другую сторону! Поверните налево! Налево!
At that angle, the wings could no longer hold the plane up, and it started to sink. When the plane was about to fall down, the automatic system kicked in to keep the plane flying, tilting the nose down to gain speed. But this caused the plane to dive straight down at 40,000 feet per minute.
Эльдар, выходи! Иди назад! Иди назад, Эльдар! Ты видишь опасность, не так ли?
But the G-forces were pressing him down into his seat so hard that he would have felt 5 times his normal weight. Although he tried to obey his father's orders, he was physically unable to move. To save the plane from the dive, Piskarev pulled the yoke as hard as he could, and the airplane began to climb up.
Бросим на холостой ход!
At that moment, Kredinsky regained his station. But the plane climbs up too fast, and the aircraft's engine didn't have enough power to push it vertically, causing the plane to stall and started to dive into a corkscrew.
Полная мощность! Полная мощность! Я дала власть!
Their speed was beginning to increase again, but they were spinning around, descending rapidly with the nose pointed almost directly to the ground.
Полная мощность! Я дал! Какая скорость!
Я не видел этого инструмента!
Furiously working the controls, the pilots started to pull the plane out of the dive, from 90 to just 20 degrees nose down.
Мы выйдем! Мы выйдем! Направо! Направо! Скорость высокая! Уменьшите мощность!
Я уменьшил его!
But the nose went up too high, and the plane slowed down. Then it suddenly dropped into another dive.
Осторожно! Нет! Нет снова!
Не поворачивай направо! Скорость! Я разгонился!
Kredinsky moved the rudder left and right to stop the spin. At that point, the spin finally stopped, and the nose lifted back to the horizon. But they didn't know how far they had already fallen. They tried to climb again, but it was too late. The plane slammed into the side of a snow mountain in southern Siberia. But what exactly caused this crash? It all started when it was Elder's turn to sit in the captain's seat. Unlike Yana, who had turned the yoke after their father adjusted the heading knob, Elder moved it before his father made any changes. That's why he felt the controls become stiff. This stiffness came from the autopilot still being activated, pushing back against Elder's movements. But Elder kept forcing the yoke, and the pressure slowly built up until the autopilot disconnected on its own without anyone realizing it. This was not a malfunction. This was actually a safety feature, so a pilot could take over instantly in an emergency without wasting time pressing the disconnect button. So at that moment, all the crew thought it was the autopilot that made the right bank maneuver, but in reality, it was Elder who was actually controlling the aircraft. But when the autopilot disengaged, why was there no warning? The Airbus A310 had 2 main autopilot systems working at the same time. One controlling the plane's direction left and right, which was called the lateral system, and the other controlling the plane's up and down movement, called the vertical system. This cooperation was crucial because the autopilot's real strength came from both systems working hand in hand, constantly correcting and stabilizing the plane in ways a human pilot would find tiring to do for hours. When Elder forcefully pushed the yoke, the vertical system autopilot was actually still on, but the lateral autopilot disconnected. This condition is called partial autopilot disengagement. In this situation, the plane was designed not to trigger any warning lights or alarms because only one part of the autopilot had shut down. If both systems were off, then the alarms and warning lights would appear. The Airbus A310 was still relatively new to Aeroflot. Most of their pilots were used to flying Soviet-built aircraft, where the autopilot was much simpler. If it disengaged, it would turn off completely, so the pilots were used to thinking of it as either fully on or completely off. That's why at that moment, none of the crew realized the autopilot was already disengaged. Moreover, when Piskarev pulled the yoke as hard as he could, they could still survive if he let go, because the plane has an inbuilt survival mechanism that won't allow it to stall. In the end, a combination of a curious young boy, a sophisticated autopilot system, and a small mistake turned an ordinary flight into a catastrophic accident.